The Spanish Empire of the 16th and 17th centuries was the envy of the known world, a vast, complex machine powered by the incredible wealth flowing from its New World conquests, a torrent of gold and silver that was supposed to guarantee eternal glory and unmatched power for the Habsburg crown. Yet, this very torrent became the most destructive force against the Spanish state, proving a paradox of history, that a nation can be utterly destroyed not by poverty or military defeat, but by an overwhelming abundance of wealth. This is the financial tragedy of Spain, the story of an empire that died of riches, revealing how the sudden, massive influx of precious metals ignited a catastrophic financial collapse, triggering hyperinflation, crippling domestic industry, and forcing the mighty Habsburg monarchy into a cycle of bankruptcies that would span centuries. The wealth of Potosi and Zacatecas, the silver mines of the Americas, was not a blessing, but a financial poison that corroded the structural integrity of the empire from within, an $8 trillion mistake in wealth management that reversed the destiny of a continent. The core of this self-destruction lay in the sheer, unprecedented volume of silver that arrived in Seville with the treasure fleets. From a mid-16th century onwards, millions of pounds of silver began pouring into the Spanish economy, metal that had been extracted through brutal, forced labor in the mines of modern-day Bolivia and Mexico, and this immense quantity of specie fundamentally broke the established European economic system. Before the conquests, the value of silver was high because it was scarce, providing a stable medium of exchange. But as the American silver flooded the markets, the value of the metal plummeted, meaning more silver was required to buy the same amount of bread, cloth, or labor, a phenomenon known as the price revolution. This inflation was not gradual. It was rapid, persistent, and devastating to the average Spanish citizen, accelerating faster in Spain than anywhere else in Europe, as it was the primary point of entry for the new wealth. The immediate effect of the price revolution was the destruction of Spanish domestic industry. As prices for goods and labor skyrocketed in Spain due to the influx of silver, Spanish manufactured products, textiles, tools, and metalwork became drastically more expensive than comparable goods produced in France, the Netherlands, or England, countries that received the American silver only secondhand and thus experienced slower inflation. Spanish merchants and manufacturers simply could not compete, finding it cheaper and easier to buy foreign-made goods with their abundant silver than to produce anything domestically. This created a colossal trade imbalance. Spain exported its silver and imported everything else, essentially turning the Spanish economy into a conduit for American wealth, routing it directly into the treasuries and factories of its European rivals. The irony is that the world's richest nation became entirely dependent on its enemies for its basic needs, proving that gold without production is merely a tool for enriching others. This industrial collapse meant that the vast, glittering wealth from the Americas was effectively flowing out of Spain as quickly as it flowed in, a constant financial drain that the crown was powerless to stop. The Habsburgs, particularly King Philip II, were misled by the physical sight of the gold and silver, believing that ownership of the metal equated to sustained wealth, but they failed to understand that real economic power lies in production and innovation. Instead of investing the New World treasure into building up Spanish infrastructure, manufacturing, or human capital, the money was immediately channeled toward two primary, non-productive expenditures: war and debt service. Philip II was constantly fighting wars across Europe, in the Netherlands against the Ottomans and against England, and these massive military campaigns devoured the silver faster than the treasure fleets could deliver it. The relentless demand for cash to fund these endless wars forced the Spanish crown into a crippling cycle of debt. Philip II, believing the next treasure fleet would always cover the current shortfall, habitually took out massive, high-interest loans from Genoese and German bankers. The collateral for these loans was the silver from the next arriving fleet, meaning that much of the gold and silver arriving in Seville was already owned by foreign creditors before it even touched Spanish soil. This reliance on short-term, high-interest borrowing created a financial structure so brittle that any delay in the treasure fleet, due to storms or foreign privateers, could, and often did, trigger an immediate crisis. This unsustainable borrowing led to the catastrophic result that defines Spain's financial history: sovereign default. Philip II famously declared Spain bankrupt no less than 4 times during his reign: 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. Each bankruptcy was not a sign of poverty, but a crisis of liquidity and management, a stunning acknowledgement that the richest man in the world could not pay his debts. These defaults devastated the foreign banking houses that had financed the crown, but crucially, they also destroyed the crown's creditworthiness, forcing them to pay ever higher interest rates on future loans, creating a vicious, accelerating cycle of debt that became mathematically impossible to sustain. This repeated financial humiliation eroded Spain's standing in Europe and ensured that the nation was constantly operating under financial duress, with its policy dictated by the immediate need for cash rather than long-term strategic goals. The wealth, therefore, became a curse. It encouraged military expansion beyond Spain's means, it destroyed the domestic economic base, and it created a toxic dependence on foreign credit, making the Habsburg Empire the ultimate paradox of global finance: rich in metal, but poor in production, credit, and self-sufficiency. The gold did not build an enduring empire. It built a gigantic, heavily armored cash withdrawal machine for the benefit of Northern European manufacturers and Italian bankers. The self-inflicted financial wounds caused by the gold influx were systematically deepened by the rigid, outdated economic policies of the Habsburg monarchy, demonstrating a fatal ideological resistance to necessary change. The massive silver flow, while destroying domestic manufacturing, should have spurred a shift toward financial innovation and investment. Yet the Spanish crown remained wedded to the archaic economic philosophy of mercantilism, focusing narrowly on accumulating physical bullion as the sole measure of wealth. This fixation meant that Philip II and his successors neglected to invest in crucial long-term projects like road infrastructure, efficient internal customs systems, or the development of modern banking and credit institutions that were simultaneously flourishing in Amsterdam and London. The contrast was stark. While Northern Europe was building financial markets, joint stock companies, and diversified trade networks that created lasting wealth, Spain was simply hoarding and spending its silver, using it to fight wars rather than to build an enduring economic structure. The failure to invest was further exacerbated by the crown's aggressive use of taxation, which directly targeted the most productive segments of Spanish society, ensuring that the few remaining domestic industries could never recover from the inflation shock. The crown relied heavily on a sales tax called the alcabala, levied on every commercial transaction, which disproportionately burdened merchants, farmers, and small manufacturers. This high, inefficient internal taxation made Spanish goods even more expensive relative to cheaper foreign imports, sealing the fate of domestic production. Furthermore, the taxes were notoriously complex and corruptly administered, leading to massive tax evasion by the powerful elites, leaving the burden to fall heavily on the middle and working classes who were already suffering from the crushing inflation. This regressive tax structure guaranteed that the vast American wealth never translated into widespread domestic prosperity or capital for reinvestment, instead concentrating the economic pain and driving away entrepreneurial spirit. The economic tragedy was intensified by the deliberate expulsion of Spain's most productive minorities. The expulsion of the Jewish community in 1492 and the final expulsion of the Moriscos, converted Muslims, in 1609 were ideologically driven policies that, while achieving religious uniformity, dealt a catastrophic blow to Spain's economic and human capital. These communities were the backbone of Spanish commerce, skilled agriculture, craftsmanship, and finance, possessing the very entrepreneurial spirit and trade connections needed to survive the inflation crisis and compete with Northern Europe. Their expulsion created massive voids in the labor market, decimated specialized craft industries, and removed a key source of financial acumen, leaving the Spanish economy weaker, less diverse, and reliant on a less skilled, less dynamic labor force. This intentional destruction of human capital for ideological reasons ensured that even the greatest influx of wealth in history could not save the nation from its own self-inflicted economic wounds, proving that human ingenuity is always a more valuable long-term asset than mere precious metal. The devastating impact of the American silver flowed directly into European geopolitics, accelerating the rise of Spain's enemies. The Spanish silver, which was supposed to secure absolute dominance for the Habsburgs, instead became the lifeblood of the armies fighting against them. Once the silver was used to buy foreign goods and pay foreign creditors, Genoese, German, and later Dutch bankers, that silver flowed out of Spain and into the treasuries and markets of France, England, and the rebellious Netherlands. This circulating silver fueled a continent-wide economic boom, giving Spain's Protestant enemies the necessary capital and stable currency to invest in their own industries, build larger navies, and ultimately finance their prolonged resistance against Philip II. Every ducat of American silver spent by the Spanish crown on foreign mercenaries or supplies inadvertently strengthened the financial position of the countries that would eventually defeat them, turning the Habsburg treasury into an unwitting and catastrophic ATM for the opposition. The constant financial desperation and the need to secure the annual treasure fleets led to a massive misallocation of Spain's military resources. The Spanish Navy, the Armada, was primarily focused on protecting the vulnerable silver lifeline from the Americas rather than projecting long-term strategic power. This obsession with the silver route required enormous, continuous investment in defending the Caribbean and the Atlantic Sea lanes, often diverting resources from crucial conflicts in the Mediterranean or Northern Europe. The famous defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, while partly due to weather and tactical errors, was fundamentally enabled by the long-term financial stability of England and the Netherlands, which were capitalizing on the very silver that had flowed through Spain. This defeat demonstrated that relying on a single, vulnerable supply chain, the silver fleets, was a strategic weakness that could be exploited by rivals who had diversified their financial and industrial bases. The repeated sovereign defaults declared by the Spanish crown did more than just bankrupt the foreign bankers. They paralyzed the entire financial nervous system of the empire. Each default involved the crown unilaterally restructuring its debts, often converting short-term, high-interest loans into long-term, low-interest state bonds, juros, a blatant form of financial coercion. This chronic unreliability destroyed the trust of both domestic and international investors, making it nearly impossible for the crown or Spanish businesses to access credit at reasonable rates. The lack of reliable credit meant that when agricultural crises or military emergencies arose, the government had no financial buffer and was forced to resort to even more desperate measures, such as imposing sudden, arbitrary taxes or even seizing private assets, further alienating the populace and crippling commercial activity. This inability to manage public debt proved that the largest empire in history was fundamentally unbankable due to its own fiscal mismanagement, a debt cycle that ensured perpetual economic underperformance despite infinite natural resources. The economic decline of Spain was a slow, agonizing process, a perfect case study in the dangers of unproductive wealth. The gold and silver provided a temporary adrenaline rush of power and spending, allowing the Habsburgs to fund immediate military grandeur, but it masked a deeper, terminal illness: the destruction of the domestic economy and the failure to foster long-term, sustainable production. The empire was living on a credit card secured by a finite resource, failing to realize that true economic supremacy belongs to the nation that can create wealth, not just extract it. The ultimate historical lesson is that silver flows are temporary, but a nation's industrial base and institutional trust are permanent, and Spain sacrificed the latter for the fleeting glory of the former, ensuring that its immense wealth would ultimately be the very tool of its ruin. This deep dive into the financial flaws of the Habsburg regime has shown how their toxic economic policies, religious purges, and military overstretch transformed America's wealth into Spain's financial poison. We must now explore the final, desperate measures taken to stave off the inevitable collapse and the lasting geopolitical consequences of this $8 trillion financial error. The catastrophic financial structure of the Habsburg Empire, fatally weakened by the continuous outflow of gold and the collapse of its domestic industry, ensured that Spain became a geopolitical pawn despite its vast overseas territories, demonstrating a clear failure to translate resource wealth into lasting power. The Crown's perpetual state of near bankruptcy meant that its foreign policy was constantly dictated by the urgent need to placate its powerful foreign creditors, primarily the Genoese banking houses, who controlled the necessary credit lines to fund the next military campaign. This financial control meant that Spain often had to allocate its military forces and diplomatic efforts not according to long-term imperial strategy, but according to the demands of its bankers, who often had their own commercial interests to protect across Europe. The Habsburgs were ostensibly the world's most powerful monarchs, yet they were effectively held hostage by the global financial markets, a stunning reversal of power where private capital dictated the policy of the world's largest empire. This financial vulnerability meant that every foreign conflict became a desperate gamble, where a victory was immediately offset by the need to repay massive debts, while a defeat could instantly trigger another sovereign default. The political consequence of the debt cycle was the erosion of centralized authority within Spain itself. Each time the crown defaulted and restructured its debt, it converted short-term loans, asientos, into long-term bonds, juros. These juros were often paid for by assigning specific future tax revenues to the bondholders, meaning that the crown was effectively selling off its future income streams and delegating authority over tax collection to private individuals or foreign banking syndicates. This system fragmented the financial control of the central government, reducing the state's ability to respond flexibly to crises and creating a complex web of private financial interests that often superseded the needs of the crown. This was the silent, systemic process by which Spain's immense wealth was siphoned out of state control and into the hands of creditors, creating a hollowed-out central government that lacked the necessary fiscal muscle to manage a global empire. The crown, by selling off its future tax revenue for immediate cash, was essentially cannibalizing its own long-term financial stability. The final, devastating aspect of the gold curse was the psychological and ideological rigidity it enforced upon the Spanish nobility and bureaucracy. The ease with which gold could be extracted and imported fostered a cultural disdain for productive labor, industry, and commerce, professions often associated with the expelled Jewish and Morisco minorities or deemed unworthy of the aristocracy. The path to wealth and power lay in colonial administration, military service, and securing royal patronage to gain a share of the American gold or a position funded by the juros, not in the hard work of building factories or improving agricultural output. This cultural bias meant that the most talented individuals were channeled into non-productive sectors, ensuring that Spain failed to develop the scientific, technological, and entrepreneurial spirit that was driving the Renaissance and the early industrialization of its northern European rivals. This ideological failure, reinforced by the belief that God had provided infinite gold, became a terminal social disease that ensured Spain would remain economically backward, even while possessing the world's largest treasury. The impact of the price revolution was so severe that it affected the very demographics of the Spanish heartland, causing internal migration and social distress. As imported goods became cheaper than locally produced ones due to inflation and high taxation, rural laborers and craftsmen often migrated to the port cities like Seville and Cadiz, hoping to secure work related to the American trade or the military, leaving large swathes of the inland agricultural land understaffed and poorly managed. This internal displacement further weakened Spain's domestic food supply and contributed to a generalized decline in agricultural output, forcing the country to rely on expensive grain imports from regions like Sicily, which had to be paid for with the very silver that was causing the problem. The gold influx, therefore, did not just destroy industry. It destabilized the domestic food supply and population distribution, turning Spain into an unstable, over-leveraged economy dependent on external sources for its most basic needs. This cycle of financial fragility culminated in the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, which, while triggered by dynastic issues, was fundamentally a war over the financial carcass of the Spanish Empire. European powers, particularly Britain and France, fought not just over the Spanish throne, but over the right to access the vast, but poorly managed Spanish-American markets and the profits from the dwindling treasure fleets. The war confirmed Spain's diminished status, as its fate was decided by the armies and treasuries of external powers, resulting in the loss of crucial territories, Gibraltar, Minorca, that secured British naval dominance in the Mediterranean and further opened up Spanish colonial markets to British trade. The final peace agreements, like the Treaty of Utrecht, explicitly included commercial clauses that benefited Britain, granting them the exclusive right, asiento, to sell slaves to the Spanish colonies and the right to send one large annual trading ship to the Spanish New World, effectively turning the Spanish Empire into a commercial appendage of its rival. The ultimate financial and historical verdict is that Spain's wealth was a catastrophic illusion. The Habsburgs spent the 16th century amassing a treasure trove that guaranteed the economic dominance of their enemies in the 17th and 18th centuries. The gold did not buy stability, nor industry, nor lasting credit. It bought short-term military campaigns and long-term financial dependence, ensuring that the Golden Age was merely a fleeting, subsidized moment before the inevitable, prolonged economic decline. The gold was the initial seed of prosperity, but the Crown's rigid, anti-commercial ideology and chronic mismanagement of debt ensured that the seed produced only the bitter fruit of inflation and bankruptcy. This tragic misuse of unparalleled wealth stands as a timeless cautionary tale about the difference between holding assets and creating value, that we have fully explored the ideological and structural financial flaws of the Spanish Empire, charting how the gold curse led to continuous bankruptcies and geopolitical weakness. We now proceed to the final details of the gold's movement and the ultimate financial lessons learned. The ultimate financial ruin of the Spanish Empire was guaranteed by the relentless, compounding nature of its debt, a self-inflicted fiscal wound that no amount of gold could heal. By the time of the final Habsburg collapse in the early 18th century, the Spanish crown was spending an average of 2/3 of its total revenue on debt service alone, primarily on the long-term state bonds known as juros. This crushing percentage, which sometimes rose even higher during periods of war, meant that only a fraction of the royal treasury could be allocated to governance, defense, or infrastructure. The massive influx of American silver was not used to build a stronger state. It was immediately diverted to a vast, private financial bureaucracy dedicated solely to paying foreign creditors and domestic bondholders. This catastrophic financial bottleneck turned the crown into a glorified tax collector for its bondholders, ensuring that the state was perpetually starved of the cash needed for necessary reform or investment, condemning Spain to systemic underdevelopment. The economic tragedy was further exacerbated by the demographic toll of the financial decline. The persistent inflation, coupled with high taxation and the collapse of domestic industry, severely reduced the quality of life for the Spanish populace, leading to widespread depopulation in the inland regions and mass migration to the coasts and colonies in search of economic opportunity. This internal flight of talent and labor meant that the agricultural base continued its decline, making Spain increasingly reliant on expensive imported food, exacerbating the trade deficit that the American gold was supposed to cover. The paradox was brutal. The nation with the most gold could not afford to feed itself or employ its own people productively, a clear demonstration that economic health is measured by output, not by specie. The gold was a mirage of wealth, hiding the reality of a starving, uncompetitive, and declining nation. The contrast between Spanish financial management and that of its emerging rival, the Netherlands, serves as the perfect historical foil, highlighting the fatal mistake of the Habsburgs. The Dutch, lacking any gold mines or massive colonial treasure fleets, built their wealth on financial sophistication, efficient trade, and institutional trust. They developed modern banking, created the first stock exchange, and utilized joint stock companies to raise capital for massive, diversified ventures like the East India Company. Their wealth was created through commerce and ingenuity, making their financial system robust and flexible, capable of absorbing shocks and extending credit reliably. Spain, meanwhile, relied solely on extraction and spending, viewing financial innovation with suspicion and relying on repeated sovereign defaults, ensuring that while the Dutch had credit, the Spanish had only coin, a distinction that ultimately decided the economic trajectory of Europe. The gold curse blinded Spain to the true sources of modern economic power. The long-term geopolitical legacy of the gold curse was the loss of the American colonies, the very source of the destructive wealth. Spain's persistent bankruptcies, coupled with its inability to invest in its colonial administration or defense, meant that by the early 19th century, the colonies were both financially and militarily neglected. The wars of independence that swept through Latin America were fundamentally enabled by Spain's inability to project financial or military power across the Atlantic, as its treasury was continuously drained by European wars and debt service. The colonies, long forced to sell their raw materials cheaply to the Spanish crown while paying high prices for imported foreign goods, often from Britain or the Netherlands, paid for with Spanish silver, had their own severe economic grievances. The gold had fueled the crown's extravagance, but had failed to build a lasting, mutually beneficial relationship with the colonies, ensuring that when the moment came, the financial and political bonds were easily severed, marking the final, irreversible end of the Spanish Empire. The final financial verdict on the $8 trillion mistake is clear. The gold of the New World did not buy Spain security. It bought only 5 decades of hyperinflationary grandeur, followed by 2 centuries of structural decline and dependence. The massive influx of specie was not absorbed by productive domestic investment. Instead, it immediately leaked out to foreign manufacturers and creditors, who used that very silver to finance the wars against the Habsburgs. The money was a catastrophic accelerant, burning through Spain's creditworthiness, its industrial base, and its human capital, all for the fleeting glory of military overreach. This is the definitive economic lesson that the Spanish tragedy offers. Unearned, unproductive wealth is the most dangerous solvent of empire, eroding the financial, social, and political foundations faster than any external enemy ever could. The empire that died of wealth serves as history's most potent warning that financial discipline and productive industry are the only true, sustainable sources of national power. We have now meticulously detailed the entire financial collapse of the Spanish Empire, charting how the flow of gold became a financial curse that led to continuous bankruptcies and the destruction of the domestic economy, culminating in the loss of global power. What do you think? Was the fall of the empire really due to military defeat? Or was the financial truth hidden on purpose to protect the reputation of those in power? Comment below and share your thoughts on the most significant financial betrayal of the 16th century.